When I was interviewing at my last church, the search committee took me on a tour of the building that ended at the sanctuary door. We're not really supposed to go in there, they apologized. We're doing some renovations. And when I looked through that little square window, I could see what they meant. All the pews had been covered in plastic sheeting, and right there at the head of the aisle was one of those big machines called a cherry picker. But even so, I could see that it was a beautiful room with tall stone columns and arches that rose up toward a vaulted ceiling some 60 feet overhead, a divided chancel with a high altar and steps leading up to a carved wooden pulpit some 10 feet off the floor. Even with all the visual distraction of plastic sheeting and cherry pickers, I could see the stained glass windows in that room, and they were beautiful. From the Willett Studios in Philadelphia, a member of the search committee told me. They were very proud of the windows, and they had reason to be. Back in the Middle Ages, when very few people could read and when the Mass was chanted in the Latin language, people would still come to the great cathedrals, where they would look around at those stained glass windows and see the gospel message presented in visual form. I think that the pastor who presided over the construction of that sanctuary in Washington, D.C., had the same sort of thing in mind, that even if you didn't hear a good sermon on Sunday, which was possible, you might see one. After I came to that church, I used to stop by the sanctuary on weekday afternoons. 3 or 4 o'clock, when the afternoon sunlight was slanting through the rose window, I could sit there on a pew in that beautiful place and be bathed in light that was blue and purple, green and gold. I fell in love with those windows. My favorite was the redemption window, the big one up above the rear balcony. On the lower level, you could see Abraham and Isaac headed up toward that mountain of sacrifice with that ram already caught in the thicket and waiting for them. Up above that row, there was Moses holding the 10 Commandments in his arms, coming down from Mount Sinai, having led the people out of their slavery in Egypt and through the Red Sea. And then above Moses was Jesus, the Good Shepherd, holding a lamb in his arms, even as he trampled out the grapes of wrath, judgment on the world. That window was a sermon in stained glass, spreading the message that God loved his world so much he was willing to do whatever it took to buy it back from the slavery of sin. I loved that window. My next favorite was the one right over here above this balcony. It was a window to the left and down a little bit called the Average Baptist. I just loved that. Here was a man, sorry ladies, it was a man, in kind of a simple brown suit, holding under his arm a blue Bible that was the size of a piece of luggage. The Average Baptist. My third favorite was the one that carries the theme for this Sunday, the Ascension window. Right around that part of the sanctuary and up, when I looked up, I could see that window, the last one in a series depicting the life of Christ that started over here and went all the way around the balcony level, some 60 different images. But this was my favorite. You could simply see the pierced feet of Christ rising up at the top of the frame, and then around his ankles, swirling like a smoke ring, the hem of his garment. Down below his feet, you could see these strong vertical shafts of pure white light. It looked for all the world like the liftoff of the space shuttle. Jesus ascending into heaven, and his disciples gathered around in a circle, looking up with their mouths hanging open. Ascension. It's not something the average Baptist thinks about very often. But if he would open up that big Bible under his arm and read it from time to time, he might think about it more. While Luke is the only New Testament writer who tells the story of the ascension, all the other writers seem to accept it as a given. 1 Peter 3:22 tells us that Jesus has gone into heaven. Ephesians 4:10 says, "He who descended is he who also ascended." Colossians 3:1 encourages us to seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. 1 Timothy 3:16 claims that Jesus was taken up in glory. Hebrews 4:14 says we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. And Hebrews 9:24 affirms that Christ has entered heaven itself. It's the kind of biblical witness that led the formulators of the early creed to include the ascension as an essential article of faith. The Apostles' Creed says bluntly, He ascended into heaven. The Nicene Creed speaks of Jesus who ascended into the heavens. And although it is not a creed, don't get confused, the Baptist faith and message also testifies that Jesus ascended into heaven and is now exalted at the right hand of God. Ascension is not just a footnote in biblical theology. It is a full chapter and an important element in any attempt to understand the life and ministry of Jesus. We should think about it more than we do, certainly more than once a year. I found myself thinking about it not long ago when I was preparing a funeral message and reading through 1 Corinthians 15, that great resurrection chapter that Paul writes. I was reading it in Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of the New Testament called The Message. And reading along, I stumbled across verse 47, in which Peterson writes, "The first man, Adam, was made from earth. The second man, Christ, was made from heaven." Was made from heaven, I said out loud, and wondered, what would it mean to be made from heaven? No sooner had I said it than I was visited by an old memory. I remembered a time at summer camp when I had been in the shallow end of the swimming pool and waded over to one side where someone had left one of these large iron weights, the kind you would put on the end of a barbell, 25 pounds worth of iron. I slid it over to where I was, took it into my hands and held it at waist level, and found that as long as I held it there, I could walk around on the bottom of the pool, no matter how deep the water got. It was slow and awkward, but I could walk in water that was up to my neck. And then, looking toward the deep end, I took a deep breath and kept walking down the slope into the deep end of the pool, 12 feet deep, and over to the far wall, where I put down the weight and naturally began to rise toward the surface. With that memory in my head and that text in my head, I wondered if that's how it was for Jesus, the man from heaven. As long as he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, could he walk around on earth like everyone else? But once he put down that weight in his death and resurrection, did he naturally begin to rise? Now, this is a metaphor. Please don't take it too literally. I'm trying to illustrate the ascension for you. But I do think about Jesus in the garden on that first morning when Mary Magdalene came and found him there. Do you remember what he said to her? "Don't hold on to me. I'm ascending." And I picture her always with her arms wrapped around his ankles while he's going up. "Don't hold on to me," he says. "I'm trying to ascend, to break the surface of heaven and take my first full breath in a long, long time." I love that hymn, "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." Sing it as often as I can, sometimes at home when no one is listening, preferably when no one is listening.